Hi there. Today I'm speaking to Jennifer Scheinman, a seasoned registered dietitian nutritionist with more than 20 years of experience in nutrition and wellness. She has a master's degree in integrative and functional nutrition and advanced training from the Institute of Functional Medicine. And she's the senior manager of nutrition affairs at Timeline, the sponsor of this podcast. So she's going to talk to us about their postbiotic molecule, Urolithin A or Urolithin A. When we get to the bottom of that, I'll ask her about her feelings about nutrition and all the arguments that we have, and maybe even about seed oils. I hope you enjoy it. What would you say there's so many outlooks on nutrition, and I just wonder if you have a philosophy or an approach.
Yeah. My philosophy is I really like the women that I work with, I try to make things real life and accessible for people. I think there is so much noise right now in the nutrition space, whether it's for controlling your weight in perimenopause or like working out or whatever it is, it's become so like prescriptive. And I think that's really that all or none mentality is really challenging and really hard to apply into the real world. So, I mean, at the foundation of my philosophy is like it has to be whole foods though, right? Like it has to be as much as possible, like trying to limit as much as possible the ultra processed foods, trying to eat as close to nature intended. But then between them, is it carnivore or is it keto? That's really where it becomes, I think, the more individual choice of the woman. I think there is science that we need fiber. Carnivores would not be like my first choice of things, but there is a therapeutic advantage for people who are having some really terrible GI issues. It is very individualized and what resonates with people and what their goals are. And I know that's not a sexy answer in the sense of, yeah, everybody should be doing this, but it's just life is stressful enough. And when you start stressing out about everything you put in your mouth, then that just starts to backfire. Whole foods as much as possible, incorporating it is plant-based to me it doesn't need to be like completely vegan, but like as much plants as possible, quality protein sources, and then the rest is up to you and what fits into your lifestyle and your goals.
Do you find with the people you deal with, are they quite different in what they can handle and what they can't handle?
Yes, different both in their food tolerances, but then also different in what their family lives are like, what their work life, what their time is to prep and put into nutrition and lifestyle. So that's why it's just this individualized approach to me makes so much more sense because what you like to eat and what is available to you and what works in your time. And if you eat with children and a significant other is different than me. I don't have children. I don't have a significant other. I'm just cooking for myself. That's very different, right? We live in different countries. The
Yeah.
things that are accessible to us are completely different. And then you and I have very different biology too, right? So yes, I work with some people who do great on dairy and they love it and they incorporate that a lot into their diets. And then I have people that I work with that just cannot tolerate dairy in any shape or form, cannot even with like lactate or, and so some of that is trial and error to figure out what works and what resonates. And some of it is just you're super inflamed and you've got some gut issues. Let's try pulling out dairy and see how you feel, right?
Mhm. Yeah,
So
that's really
yeah.
interesting. It seems like it was a world where everyone had intolerances and they were appreciated for the intolerances or understood for the intolerances. That's what I should say. And I had a lot of gut issues myself. And then now it seems if you have an intolerance and you just don't want to eat something, there's this sort of tone of you could eat that if you put it back in your diet. Like I find that with dairy, the pro-metabolic people are like, you can put dairy back in your diet. And it's maybe some people can. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah. The goal with any elimination diet, like when I'm working with someone who's got, let's like you, for example, who has severe gut issues, right? You do need to pull a lot of stuff out in the beginning to just rest the gut, allow everything to heal. But the goal is to incorporate back in as much things as possible. And so when you do heal the gut and not everything is inflamed, and yeah, you can start to tolerate a lot of things, but there's some things that some people just will never tolerate again. Like, for example, like I don't eat gluten anymore. Like
Mm.
and even when I try it, I feel really crummy. And so it's just something that I'm okay with it. I don't tolerate it. I don't eat it anymore. But there was a time when I didn't do well with dairy and I do great with dairy. So again, I think that's all very individualized and what you do to work on your gut. I think the idea is that most people can introduce a lot of things back after they've been on an elimination diet, but there's also some things that just the big things usually are like dairy, Gluten, those are probably two big things that most people, soy is another one I find that people really struggle with when they start introducing that back. They just don't ever really do well with it again. And that's okay too. We live in a world now, thankfully, where there are so many amazing substitutions, like so many non-dairy delicious foods. There's so many gluten-free foods. There's so many things that you can do that you don't have to feel completely deprived if there's something you don't tolerate anymore.
Something that I fell into in perimenopause, now this was a long time ago, but when I was having my lifelong sort of IBS was blowing up into gut issues, I knew much less. I was trying to eat healthy. I was eating processed healthy food. And it was really, and protein powder was probably one of the worst things for me, but I didn't know because I was told this was like healthy, and it took me way too long to figure out. So I don't know, are you still seeing that? Do you have any advice for people in how to navigate that? Is it the whole food
Yeah,
thing again?
it's the whole food thing. And you just made like such a perfect point of processed healthy is like an oxymoron, right? Like maybe it's along the spectrum. A potato chip, whether it's Lay's or whether it's like organic potato fried in avocado oil, like that's still probably not our healthiest choice. Like it's maybe better than the Lay's choice, but let's
Mhm.
not call that a health food. Um, Protein powder has a place for sure in people's diet, especially if they're really struggling to get protein in. But again, it's heavily processed. I don't consider it necessarily like a health food in the sense that it's not unhealthy, but it's not the same thing as like eating a piece of chicken or eating a piece of steak or having eggs. So again, it's if you're really struggling with GI issues, you want to pull out as much stuff as could be irritating as possible, things with fillers. There was just a report recently about crazy amounts of lead that were found and other heavy metals that were found in protein powders, right? And if somebody is really like struggling and they have a lot of like heavy metals potentially in their system, like we don't want to be giving them more protein powder unless we're sure that it's one that's been third party tested and doesn't have heavy metals. It can be a challenge. But then on the other hand, and I know I'm being wishy-washy here, is like if you're someone who's super busy, you don't have time to cook, then maybe protein powder is appropriate for you to help you meet your protein needs. So it depends what's your goal, what you're trying to work on, what your lifestyle is. And I think that's really the role of a nutritionist or a health coach to work with you as an individual and kind of try and figure out, okay, this might be really contributing to what's happening inside your gut. Let's try pulling it out. And even if it's just for a couple of weeks, I know it's going to be more challenging to have to cook, but let's just try it for a couple of weeks and see if we can get things to calm down. So yeah, but I think yeah, I'd rather you have air quote healthy processed food than unhealthy processed food, but as much as we can move away from things that are coming prepackaged, and that's not realistic for everybody.
I've been around this bend, and it always goes better when I cook for myself. And then when you're not the I want to get into the emotional element, because when I'm not cooking for myself, that means I'm very busy. And so I'm more stressed. So I feel like there's a loop, right? I can never figure out, is it the healthy takeout food I'm getting? And then I usually always conclude, no, you're like, to me now, it's so much my head, because I can have bits of all those foods. I incorporated tons back in. And I almost always, the first thing when I have gut problems is I'll start thinking about what I ate and micromanaging my food. And I almost always come back to something that happened that I didn't deal with. So how is this part of your job now? Like now that we've connected all this stuff?
Yeah. It's funny, so I've been a dietitian for, gosh, it's almost 30 years now. And it's funny because like I started out and like I wanted my own private practice. And when I started seeing people, I realized like I wasn't trained on any of the like psychology and behavior of eating, which is like a huge part of it. And I would have somebody come in and say, I just sat down and I ate a whole pint of ice cream and I didn't even know what to do with that. And I was like, well, just don't do it. Don't eat it. I don't, which obviously I know now, like it's not that simple. And so yes, there's the huge mind-body connection. I think there's something about when you're cooking for yourself, it's like a form of self-care. And to your point, you have time to do that. But I have really, as my practice has evolved, moved very much away from these very prescriptive meal plans because I really think the stress of eating a certain way and being perfect it just backfires and it makes you feel crummy. You don't get enjoyment out of a lot of things. I used to see people who would come to me from other potentially chiropractors or acupuncturists. It's not to diss on them, but they would come to me and they would be in tears and they're like, my acupuncturist told me I can literally only eat salmon and white rice, and that's it, right? And I'm like, no, no, let's figure that out, right? And that's not a way to live either, right? So there's so much like the brain gut connection. Like we now know the vagus nerve is basically a super highway between your gut and your brain. And it regulates, and also our gut microbiome, we're now learning, has these postbiotic molecules that they start to release that can impact our nervous system as well. It plays a role in serotonin production, other neurotransmitters. So everything is connected inside our bodies. And it's not just about what we ate. Yeah, of course. If you have a lactose intolerant and you sat down and you had a glass of milk and you start bloating and going to the bathroom, yeah, that's a pretty easy one to pinpoint. But if you ate relatively normal yesterday, maybe you ate a meal out and your tummy feels a little off, could be a lot of things.
Mhm. The moon. No, I'm just joking. It's a full moon today.
Yeah, totally.
I feel off. So you talked about the postbiotic, and that's the product from mitopure. And I just wondered if you could explain what's going on there. How does that work, those postbiotic molecules?
So I think we are on this like incredible journey right now where we are really starting, like, we've known for so long the importance of the gut microbiome, right? And we are now peeling back these layers of what is it about this bacteria that lives in our gut that's so important for us. And one of the things I think it's like Dr. Mark Hyman, I've heard him say, our gut is basically like a pharmacy for us, meaning that our microbiome produces molecules that we get to utilize and are healthy for us. So in really simple terms, the way I like to think about it is we have this bacteria that live in our gut, and we basically give them room and board. They get to live inside our gut, protected, and they actually get to eat the things we can't digest. For example, fiber. We don't digest most forms of fiber, and so our gut microbiome can eat that. In the case of Urolithin A or mitopure, they're specific polyphenols. These are compounds inside of plants. And again, we don't digest them, but our gut microbiome does. And they pay us back for that room and board with these postbiotic molecules. And so one example of that is Urolithin A, which I know is a mouthful, and probably most of your listeners have never even heard of that. So we can dive into that. But there are probably like thousands of molecules that our gut is producing for us, and we reap the benefits from that.
Okay, so how does it work specifically?
Yeah, urolithin A specifically targets, and we'll try and keep this at a high level science lesson, but it targets basically the energy centers of our cells. Our cells run on a power pack called the mitochondria. Most people have almost like a knee-jerk reaction. You hear mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell, right? We learned that in high school biology, but we probably also quickly forgot about it as soon as we finished taking that pop quiz. So the mitochondria provide cellular energy. And unfortunately, though, those power packs, just like your cell phone battery, it starts to die after wear and tear, right? And that is actually one of the contributing factors on why we age. One of the biological reasons that we age is we have less cellular energy. And that's why also we feel less energetic as we get older, right? Look at a toddler versus look at a 7-year-old person. There's a very difference in energy level there. And a piece of that puzzle is this decline in our cellular batteries.
Okay, so if you're taking this postbiotic molecule, urolithin A, am I saying it right?
Yep. Yep. Urolithin A, you got it.
How can you expect it to work in your body, and what can you expect to get from it?
Yeah, so what it's doing is it is triggering a recycling process of those sort of outdated batteries, those outdated mitochondria. So our bodies are so cool and they are self-healing, right? And when our mitochondria become dysfunctional, we have this innate ability to recognize, like, hey, you're a broken down battery. Let's demolish you all. Let's recycle what we can and reuse. But that process also breaks down as we get older, right? So you start to have more broken down mitochondria, less recycling process. So urolithin A specifically helps to upregulate that process our body should already be doing, that recycling process. And we know that it does that because there's a great clinical study that's been published that has actually looked at people who took urolithin A compared to a placebo for 4 weeks, for 1 month, and muscle biopsies were done. So they actually take a little bit of muscle tissue because there's not a great way to measure mitochondrial health. If you went to your doctor, I went to my doctor and said, hey, can you measure my mitochondria? There's just not a good way to do that in like a clinician's office. But in a clinical study, there is a great way. And so they take this tissue from your muscles and they can look at it under really high-tech imaging. They can do gene testing and they can see, in fact, when you take urolithin A, you have a significant improvement in mitochondrial function. But so, yeah, to your point, how am I going to feel, right? What is that going to do to me? And what we see both in clinical studies and then what we hear from people who take supplemental urolithin A is they notice significant improvements in muscle strength.
Okay.
The other thing that we hear very often is I feel more energetic. And that's something I noticed when I started taking urolithin A. And it takes a while to do. So it's not like you take this and you feel it tomorrow. But I call it like feeling like myself again, like especially as a perimenopausal woman who was starting to really feel that like decline in energy, just like, oh, I'm so tired all the time. It's not like I took a Red Bull or like I had a big like cold brew. It's more just like I feel like myself again. Like I work out after work. So I get through a whole day of work. I get to work out. I get to cook dinner. I I get through my day and I feel good. Like I'm not dragging myself through it. So it's just this like I call it subtle energy.
Subtle energy. I love it. So how has
Yeah.
perimenopause been treating you?
Oh, well, it depends on the day. So I'm 49 and I am definitely like into it. It's interesting when I talk to both myself, my clients, my friends, it's just different for all of us. For me, I think the things I've noticed the most, I've been like waiting for the hot flash. Like that's like what we all think is going to happen. And I get warm and I'm like, is this hot flash? Am I having one? But for me, the biggest things I've noticed are brain function, like my focus, my memory. Like I can be talking and like holding a cup of coffee and being like, this brown liquid, what is this stuff called again? Like just
Yeah.
words that should be easy. I just definitely, I've noticed changes in my body for sure, despite, and this was another thing, like I was never taught as a young dietitian that I like it was just like eat less, move more, all of that. And I'm like, I'm not doing anything different. Like, why am I gaining weight? Why is my body changing? All of that is happening. So those have been the two, and mood. Those are probably the big three ones for me. There's just been so many interesting like research and studies and just even surveys showing though that I hear sometimes 30 different symptoms. Sometimes I hear it's 100 different symptoms. There is so much that happens to our body as our hormone levels start to decline. And so I think that's why every woman's journey is so unique and different.
Yeah. Early on, I interviewed a Dr. Anise Mukherjee, and I was really
Mm.
obsessed with how many symptoms there were. And she just said, stop counting because the hormones run so many processes. So she said it's endless and pointless. And I thought that was funny. But I do know that Google says 34. And then my friend Andrea Donsky did research and they've
Mm.
clocked 103. And then I talked to other experts who are like, I'm not a huge fan of some of those symptoms being listed as perimenopause symptoms because if you're losing hair, if you're some of the symptoms that are concerning that you would want to get checked out for, I think if you're losing your hair, like that's just an example of one that it's maybe just don't chalk it up to perimenopause. There's some underlying causes to a lot of this stuff, even brain fog, even hot flashes. I don't know. What do you think
Absolutely.
about that? Like,
Well,
what's your take?
absolutely. Because I've actually also been struggling with some symptoms that, like, my doctor, after doing some tests, I actually don't think like, I thought it was perimenopause too. And she's actually, I think you've got some potentially, like, some other things that are going on. Let's work on those and see. I think the importance about these symptoms, and I agree, like, hair loss could be thyroid, it could be a nutritional deficiency, it could be a lot of, and most of these fatigue, like, you look up fatigue and, like, it's everything from, like, you're dying to, like, you just didn't sleep well last night.
Yeah.
I think though, the thing about these conversations around perimenopause, the symptoms are reasons to start having conversations with your doctor and to not just chalk it up to let me muscle through this because it's just my hormonal changes. Because even if it is, and I don't mean just in a bad way, but even if it is just perimenopause, which is like a natural process, there are things that you can do so you don't have to suffer through that. So it is going to your doctor and finding out, is this something that's potentially a lot more concerning than perimenopause, right? Like that we really need to treat medically, or is this like perimenopause and let's find something that can help you feel better during this time. And I think it's important, especially because doctors, at least here in the US, are not well trained to handle the perimenopause transition. And this was like shocking to me when I first realized, I think even OB/GYNs, right? So doctors who their entire career is dedicated to women's health get a few hours of perimenopausal training, which every woman who is lucky enough to live a long life is going to go through perimenopause, right? And so it's just absurd that they're not there to be able to have conversations to help hold women's hands and to tell them these are your options everywhere from diet, nutrition, supplements, lifestyle to hormone therapy if that's the route you want to go. So I think these conversations around symptoms are really important, but women should be still going to their doctors to talk about them because, to your point, they could be something that's a lot more serious.
No, I like them being talked about too, because I think so many women come across all these practitioners. Like I'm talking massage therapists, personal trainers, physios. Like I didn't know I was in perimenopause till I was 48. I had a terrible time. Although a lot of it was my gut in the end, causing other problems. If any one of the people I'd gone across to go for my muscle pain, the physio, or this or that, or had just been like a tiny bit informed, they would have been able to say, have you considered that you're in perimenopause? There's this thing, perimenopause. So I am happy about that because I
Yeah.
just feel like at all of the people we go to when we're not feeling well, trying to find a solution, could all just get a clue, even of the 34.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's
Diagnosis.
part of the problem with just healthcare in general, right?
Yeah.
Is like you go to a heart doctor to talk about your heart and they don't talk about your gut at all, right? But if there's inflammation in your gut, then there's inflammation that's probably happening in your cardiovascular system too. And unfortunately, we've just broken down healthcare into these very specific little components. And I think that's why functional medicine and integrative medicine are just having such a boom because they look at like the whole system. If you've got issues showing up in one system, chances are if it hasn't shown up in another system, it's going to, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's exactly right. If you're going to someone for your back pain or your frozen shoulder, for example, that they are saying, oh, we see this very commonly in women in your age group. Maybe your hormones should be checked too. And that doesn't mean that like hormone therapy is going to fix the frozen shoulder, but maybe doing things together will get you to your goals a little bit faster. Yeah.
Were you always on the functional integrative side, or did you find your way over there?
No, I found my way over, which I think is what most people, when I graduated college in 97, there wasn't really functional medicine at that point was like very hippy dippy and it was a very different world. I found my journey, which I think is what most people I know is when I went through my own health crisis that regular conventional medicine couldn't help. So I got diagnosed in my early 40s, but I was suffering with it for a while. I had chronic Lyme disease. And that was when I was getting lab test after lab test and everything was normal. And it was like I was being told, like, you're just getting older. And I was like, I'm 40. I don't have kids. I don't have a spouse. I don't think that the amount of fatigue that I feel is normal for a 40-year-old that doesn't have a lot of stressors in her life. And finally, I found functional medicine. And because she was like the only person who was like, I hear you. I'm going to hold your hand through this. We're going to figure it out. And Dr. Google was telling me that I had chronic Lyme, but I didn't even say that to her. And she was like, I suspect you might have Lyme. And I was like, ah, okay, let's go down this path. And then I got into functional nutrition at that point too. Yeah.
Oh, that's really cool. So you've never been married and you don't have kids. You're just like me.
No, yeah, just didn't happen that way. I've got two nephews and that is enough. And
Do
I
you
see your
think,
fur baby. I have a little
yeah,
dog somewhere that's like yeah, he's my little
she
guy.
never does this in the podcast. I don't know what. Usually she just wanders around meowing and just like disturbing me.
Oh, she wants to be part of the conversation. It's a good one.
Yeah. I'm curious if you feel that because you just said no stress, right? And I know that is something that I carried, right? Where it's like, why am I complaining? I don't have kids. I don't have to balance all this stuff. So I would always take on, and I still do, a lot of stuff. And I just wonder if you like, I feel like that made my perimenopause in a way worse because I wouldn't ever allow myself to just be like a human having a hard time. I had to be a
Yeah,
human who didn't have the burdens of all the other women having a hard time. I wonder what you thought. Is that resonating or does that make sense
a
to you?
little. Well, so it's interesting that you say that because I actually think
And
that
can I
my
just say one thing, Jennifer? 1,000%, it's true. Like, I even started Hot Flash because I'm like, how do all these women figure out their perimenopause? Like, I've got the time, so I'm going to do it. So I
yeah,
don't mean to be like, it's not true. It's just a little
yeah,
bit.
no, yeah, no. I think that's always been like I have a number of friends also that don't have kids, and sometimes we always feel like, why do we have to do like extra work to like balance? Like we got to volunteer to take on like
Mhm.
the weekend shift because you have kids and all of that. And I think stress in general that just impacts our health and everything from our gut to our hormones. I actually think that my Lyme, I think exacerbated. I think I probably had it for a while, but had exacerbated in my 40s because I actually went through this sort of big letting go of I thought I was going to be married and have kids and this isn't the life. And it was like, and questioning who am I? And it was really all tied together with turning 40. And while that's not an exact answer to your question, sorry, the dog told you he was here. We had snow last night, and
Oh,
so everybody's doing their driveways, which is getting him crazed.
just getting riled
Can you
up.
hear me okay now? Or you
Yeah,
still hear
yeah,
him?
yeah.
Okay. But so the point of that is not to not answer your question. I think that I let go of a lot of stuff in my early 40s, which I'm now bringing into this point in my life. I have a really good friend who just turned 50. We all turned 50 this year. She was the first one, and I feel really old. I really don't like it. She's having a hard time with 50. That at 40. I went through that younger, and I'm like, I can rest because I know I'm going through perimenopause and say, it's okay if I don't do this today. I feel like I'm like turning into my 50s is like a badge of honor. Like I'm here and I feel great and I've done a lot of work to get here. So I think women in general, just depending on where they are in their life, go through these growth spurts at different points. But I totally hear you and I get that. Yeah.
Yeah, and when you're single, you have more time to do that work, do the work, whatever your own work is. So I do see my friends that are my age that their kids have just gone to university or whatever. They're now feeling the same way I felt in my early 40s. So I exactly know what you're
Yeah.
talking about because
Yeah,
it comes to get
absolutely.
you eventually. It's just you might not have time for it until you're a
Totally.
bit older. Yeah.
Totally. Until all of a sudden you've got time to look at it and say, oh gosh, how did I get here?
Can I ask you a question? Because I got in a schmozzle on Instagram today because I shared a quote from someone about seed oils, and I got
Yeah.
people getting really angry
Ooh.
at me because I mentioned that you might not want to eat processed vegetable oils. So I just wanted to know, this seems to be one of those issues that are, and
Yeah.
it just amazes me how it is, how divisive it is, and how one side sees one reality and one side sees the other reality. So could you just tell me what you're thinking?
Yeah, and it is a tough one because when you look at the science, so when we look at, let's just start with what tends to be like the gold standard, and that doesn't mean the gold standard has to be the be all and end all, but like when we look at outcomes-based data, and we look at large populations who are eating seed oils and have changed that from saturated fat, they do have better health outcomes. They do have lower risks of heart disease. But when we also look at the biology of like how the omega 6s that are in seed oils work, they do also go on inflammatory pathways that are inside the body. And there is for sure an imbalance with all the processed food that we eat, where we are eating a lot more of these inflammatory oils and a lot less of the anti-inflammatory omega 6s. So my take on it is I don't think they're like toxic and going to kill you if like you eat them. But if you are eating a lot of them, chances are you're eating a very processed food diet, even those healthy, processed healthy foods. And so it might be an opportunity to look at your diet and say, gosh, maybe I need to shift away from some of this stuff. Like, how hard is it to make my own salad dressing that maybe doesn't have canola oil in it? And that can last like a week. It's easy. Maybe not to be having the potato chips and to look for a healthier snack. To call them like toxic, I feel like that is a bit of like marketing speak and influencer speak. But I do think that there is an opportunity to examine how much of these fats are in your diet and is that really the healthiest food choice for you? So it's nuanced. And I think to your point, has become very almost like a religion, like very divisive and like you have to eat this way or you have to eat that way. And I went through, and this is why like women, especially that I work with, I think that are in our age group that have gone through like the yo dieting and like the body image stuff and like they have these like fears of food, right? Like we are like calorie counting and like Weight Watchers pointing. And then now all of a sudden, oh my God, I can't eat that because it has oil in it, or I can't eat that because it has sugar in it. This just all adds to this psychological toxicity also that's impacting our bodies. I myself went through a time where I was like, would be like paralyzed in the supermarket. This is like $10 more than this one, but it doesn't have seed oil in it. So is it worth spending $10 more on this than this? But like, I'm really only going to eat this like salad dressing like once a week. Like, this is just like a lot of noise. And like the truth of the matter is that Americans are not eating enough fruits, vegetables, whole foods that like a salad dressing that has this in it is probably not going to be the thing that's going to make or break you. And so that's my thought on it. It's complicated.
Oh, is it ever complicated?
Yeah.
When I had my gut issues, I couldn't eat these things. So if I would have a bar, there's a lot of healthy
bars that have those in them, and that I would always be, they would bother me. But when my gut is humming along, I can eat them, but I just don't like to very often. I just tell people that they might affect how you feel, but it could be 6 other things in the thing you ate. I just think it's interesting that there's just such a rabid response when you talk about them. And someone today called me dangerous because I shared a quote about it. And I'm like, how is it dangerous to share a quote about seed oils? Isn't someone just going to see the quote and say, oh, maybe I can look into that? Or maybe I choose to keep going. Like, how on earth would that ever be dangerous? I don't get it. But it was a dietitian who feels really strong.
So omega-6s, which are these sort of inflammatory, they still are essential. We actually still need some. That doesn't mean you should be like drizzling everything you eat with soybean oil. I think at least in the US, it is very hard to have 0 omega-6s in your diet. You'd have to really try. You'd have to eat nothing processed and never even a nut or a seed. So I don't think it's dangerous to say, look at your ingredients and question how much like seed oils are in your diet. I think you're doing absolutely the right thing. It's just educating consumers to go out and look and to make their own decisions. That's what I think my role is. Even when I'm working with somebody one-on-one, my role is not to say, you have to eat this and nothing else. My role is to say, here's the information. You tell me what you want to do, and then let's come up with something that works. You don't ever want to eat seed oils again? Cool, great. Let's figure out how to do that. Seed oils are okay for you? Cool, great. Let's maybe figure out how we can not have them being like the star of the show and balance them out with other healthier fats.
Yeah, it's just silly to be arguing because it gets nuanced and the truth is somewhere in the middle. Listen, thank you so much, Jennifer. It's really great to talk to you.
It was great to talk to you as well. Thank you.
Hot Flash Inc. was created and is hosted by Marie McQueen, produced and edited by Sonia Mack. The information contained in this podcast is intended for informational purposes only and is not intended for the purpose of diagnosing, treating, curing, or preventing any disease. Before using any products referenced on the podcast, consult with your healthcare provider, read all labels, and heed all directions and cautions that accompany the products. Information received through the podcast should not be used in place of a consultation or advice from a healthcare provider. If you suspect you have a medical problem, i.e. menopause or anything else, or any healthcare questions, please promptly see your healthcare provider. This podcast, including Marie McQueen and any producers or editors, disclaim any responsibility from any possible adverse effects from the use of any information contained herein. Opinions of guests on this podcast are their own, and the podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about a guest's qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements and advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. This podcast is owned by Hot Flash Inc. Media.